Hey everyone, it's Alexander, the real Mr. Robinson. So it's October, it's Halloween season, which means it's time for another series of retro horror movie reviews. Now last year, in honor of the 40th anniversary of the original Friday the 13th, I reviewed all the sequels and the 2009 remake. But I left one movie out specifically, and that was Freddy vs. Jason. The reason for that was because I have not reviewed the Nightmare on Elm Street series. With the exception of the first movie, I have not reviewed the others. I haven't even seen all the other Nightmare movies. So I figured, you know what? Rather than doing 5 random horror movie reviews this year, I'm just going to jump straight into the Nightmare on Elm Street series. That way we can actually get into Freddy vs. Jason sooner than later. But before that, it's appropriate that I review the Nightmare on Elm Street sequels and the 2010 remake. So let's get this thing started. And we're going to kick things off with my review for 1985's A Nightmare on Elm Street 2: Freddy's Revenge, which came out 1 year after the original Nightmare on Elm Street, but actually takes place 5 years after the first movie. The movie follows a high school boy named Jesse, played by Mark Patton, whose family had just recently moved into the old Elm Street house that Nancy Thompson lived in the first Nightmare on Elm Street movie. Why? Well, because it was dirt cheap to buy. I wonder why that was the case. Anyway, much like Nancy, he's been having nightmares, and most of them revolve around Freddy Krueger. So he is constantly trying to battle with not only these ongoing nightmares, but with the fact that Freddy Krueger wants to enter the real world by basically possessing Jesse. So like I said before, I've already reviewed the original Nightmare on Elm Street movie. I think it's one of the best horror movies ever made, certainly one of the most defining horror films of the 80s. It's such a creative and original slasher movie, and Freddy Krueger himself has become one of the most iconic figures in all of horror, and I absolutely love it. It's one of my absolute favorite movies of all time. It did have a really terrible ending, I will admit that. As much as I love that original movie, that ending, even Wes Craven hated it, so at the end of the day, it doesn't ruin the movie for me, but it's pretty bad. No fan of this movie can look at you with a straight face and say, yeah, that ending rocks. But now we've got the sequel, Nightmare on Elm Street 2, which has really nothing to do with the previous movie. I mean, they mention Nancy a couple of times and Jesse lives in her old house, but it feels very much like a sequel that's made just to capitalize on the success of the first movie. And the fact that this movie came out a year later clearly shows. It's similar to how Godzilla Raids Again came out 1 year after the first Godzilla, and was really just made to capitalize on the success of the first movie. But that's honestly the only major issue I have with the movie, is that it suffers heavily from sequelitis. Because I think there's a lot to admire about this movie right here. I'll talk about the big elephant in the room later on, but in terms of a movie that felt like a rushed sequel, they still do a really good job with all the nightmare sequences. There's some pretty great kills, and some of them can be pretty imaginative. The plot itself, when it comes to developing the mythology and legacy of Freddy Krueger, works. And Freddy Krueger himself is really not all that comedic. I know everyone thinks of Freddy Krueger as a good mix of scary and comic, but in this movie, I think he's more scary and more sadistic than he was in the first movie. Because in the first movie, Freddy Krueger definitely had a few comedic moments, like, "I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy." And now that makes it 2 videos in a row where I've had to use my tongue to describe scenes in movies. It's so bizarre. In this movie, getting back to Freddy Krueger, I don't think there's ever a moment where he actually makes a joke or a pun. Like, he's creepy, he's scary, and the plot of him wanting to take possession of Jesse's body just to enter the real world from the dream world is kind of effective. You feel very sorry for him, considering that Freddy's just taking over this guy and he's killing people without even knowing he's killing people, because, you know, Freddy Krueger's possessed his body. And his girlfriend Lisa is likable as well. And that's the thing I've noticed when watching the first, second, and third movie of this series, is that unlike the characters of Friday the 13th, who are just a bunch of dumb, idiot hornballs, the characters in the Nightmare on Elm Street movies are very likable, they're very caring of one another, And there's not really a whole lot of emphasis on sex or nudity, which I guess that would be a perfect segue to talk about the big things surrounding this movie and why it's become such a cult classic. The gay undertones. Okay, no, I laughed because I said the word undertones when describing this movie's gay factor, because it's right front and center. Like, you watch this movie, you cannot miss it. There is the well-known fact that when Mark Patton was making this movie, he was gay, but he was still closeted at the time. And also the fact that a movie this gay came out dead center in the middle of the 80s is truly an accomplishment. Apparently the film's screenwriter wrote it with some gay undertones, but the director of the movie, the guy who was responsible for making this movie look as gay as it is, wasn't aware of it. I'm like, dude, how can you not be aware that this movie is so gay? I mean, you have your main character in a dream meeting his gym teacher at a gay bar. You have several shots of Jesse waking up out of bed sweaty. You have several shots of him in his tighty whities. You have a scene where he is dancing in his room. He has a little pop gun and he has it where his crotch is, and then it pops out as soon as his mother and his girlfriend walk into the room. You cannot be oblivious to how gay this movie is, and this is not at all a criticism of the movie itself. I really do like and admire the fact that this movie is as gay as it is, and it's also a nice parallel to the Friday the 13th movies. When you watch the Friday the 13th movies, outside of the kills, one of the other big things that it really focuses on is the sex and nudity, especially when you get to Friday the 13th Part 5, which came out the same year, 1985. That movie, if you've seen my original review, I talk about how incredibly sleazy that movie is, especially when it comes to the scene of Debbie Sue Voorhees lying down in the forest naked for a good minute, where the camera's just on her. That is a little too much. So in a subgenre where for a long period of time they sexualized women's bodies, it is a refreshing change of pace to have a movie where they sexualize the men. So in a sense, it's a slasher movie with eye candy for the women. And hey, let them have it. And for gay men, because, you know, this movie is so gay. Back in 2019, I went on a vacation to Austin and San Antonio, Texas, and I attended Fantastic Fest as well in the last half of my vacation. One of the movies that was shown there was a documentary that Mark Patton actually produced and starred in called Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street. And I had the chance to see it, but because I hadn't seen all the other Nightmare sequels, I just felt like I wanted to see other movies where I didn't need context. And now after seeing this movie, I really want to see that documentary, because you can really compare Jessie as a character to other iconic Scream Queen / Final Girls like Nancy Thompson or Laurie Strode. So I really do admire this movie for being as groundbreaking as it is for the genre. But beyond all the gay stuff, I felt like the movie kind of had no reason to happen. Again, it suffers heavily from sequelitis, where it really does feel like it was made to cash in on the success of the first movie, and it even has another dumb cliffhanger ending, which doesn't hurt as much this time around because I think that first Nightmare on Elm Street is a masterpiece and that ending felt really tacked on. Whereas this movie, I'll give my rating right now, it's good. So that ending doesn't feel as tacked on or as out of nowhere as it did in the first movie, but at the end of the day, this movie is not great. It didn't do anything that really wowed me, it didn't impress me, but it's got likable characters, it's got some really cool kills, Freddy Krueger is just as terrifying as ever, and again, I really do appreciate all the gay overtones. So when I planned to review the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, I had known the legacy of this movie, but I didn't know what to expect from it. And at the end of the day, while I don't think it's a masterpiece like the first one, it is something that I can definitely recommend. And there you go, that's my review for Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. Now, the way this series of reviews is going to work, much like with the Friday the 13th reviews, it's going to be every Monday and Friday of October. So next up, this Friday, I'm going to be talking about the third movie and one of the contenders for the best of the series, Nightmare on Elm Street 3: Dream Warriors. What will I think about the movie? Well, you'll have to tune in Friday to hear my full opinion. But first, I want to know what you guys think about Freddy's Revenge. If you've seen it, what did you think? Whatever the case may be, let me know in the comments below. And until next time, this is the real Mr. Robinson telling you there's only one. Hello everyone, I just wanted to say thank you all for watching my review for Nightmare on Elm Street 2: Freddy's Revenge. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell button to get notifications. Don't forget to follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, go check out my Twitch channel, and support me on Patreon. I'll see you guys in the next video, but until then, have a good day and take care of yourselves.